Somewhere in the pine-flecked lowlands of coastal Georgia, a plantation held its workers in bondage for nearly 2 years after the Civil War had officially ended. Not because they chose to stay, not because the law overlooked them, but because the landowners had made a deliberate choice, one that demanded silence, isolation, and the ongoing complicity of every white authority figure within a 50-mile radius. When federal investigators finally arrived in the summer of 1866, they discovered what one officer described in his field report as an arrangement of deliberate design. He noted that its mechanics suggested premeditation at a scale this office has rarely encountered. He wrote that the workers, men, women, and children, had been restrained not by chains, but by something far more effective, the total control of information. They had been told the war was still raging, that the Union had fallen, that freedom for people like them would never arrive. The investigators' report was filed, stamped, cataloged, and then disappeared from public view for 83 years. What transpired on that property wasn't supernatural. It didn't involve monsters, curses, or inexplicable forces. What it required was something far more unsettling: men who understood human psychology well enough to construct a prison without walls. Before we go further into the story of Hartwell Plantation and those held there, if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We explore the darkest, most forgotten corners of American history, and we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know what state or city you're watching from. Knowing where our audience is helps us find stories that hit closer to home. Because this story, this particular, meticulous human horror, should never have been forgotten. To grasp what happened at Hartwell Plantation, you first need to understand the Georgia Low Country in 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and again in 1865, when the Confederacy crumbled. McIntosh County, Georgia, occupies a narrow coastal strip shaped by salt marshes, tidal rivers, and a suffocating, ancient heat that settles in by April and doesn't relent until November. The county seat, Darien, had been burned to the ground in June 1863, not by Confederate forces, but by a regiment of black Union soldiers under Colonel James Montgomery, retaliating for the town's role in the coastal slave trade. By war's end, McIntosh County was, by nearly every measure, a shattered place. Its white planter class had lost sons, property, and the economic foundation of everything they'd known. Its black population, numbering well over 2,000 at the war's peak, had lived for generations within a social system that treated them as property, managed their movements, controlled their speech, and systematically cut them off from any information that might give them leverage over their own lives. Hartwell Plantation wasn't the largest in the county. It sat on roughly 100 acres of arable land along the Altamaha River, cultivating long, staple cotton and modest rice in the tidal fields near the water's edge. Its owner in the war's final years was Cornelius Hartwell, third-generation heir to this particular tract of Georgia soil. He was 51 in 1865. He hadn't served in the Confederate Army, citing a recurring lung condition that, depending on the account, either genuinely limited his stamina or was strategically deployed whenever conscription officers came through. He had 2 sons. The elder Edmund had died at Chickamauga in 1863. The younger Prentice returned from the war in April 1865 with a shattered left hand and a silence that his mother, Cecilia, found more disturbing than the injury itself. In the war's final weeks, as word of Confederate surrenders filtered down from Atlanta and up from Savannah, Cornelius Hartwell sat in his study and did what very few men in his position were willing to do. He thought clearly. He wasn't given to rage or denial. By the accounts of those who knew him professionally, he was methodical, the kind who kept immaculate financial records, read legal documents thoroughly, and anticipated problems before they arrived. And in those final weeks of April and May 1865, he anticipated a problem that most of his neighbors, too grief-stricken or too furious, couldn't properly process. His problem was labor. Hartwell had roughly 63 enslaved workers living and working on his property at that time. Some had been there for decades. Others were children and grandchildren of people his father had owned. They ranged from the very young to the elderly. A functioning, multi-generational community whose entire existence had been organized around the rhythms of Hartwell's fields, Hartwell's schedules, Hartwell's rules, and within weeks they would be free. What Cornelius Hartwell understood more clearly than his neighbors was that freedom wasn't merely a moral or philosophical condition. It was a logistical one. It required information. It required the ability to move, to communicate, to verify what you'd been told. And in the Georgia Low Country in the spring of 1865, for people who had been systematically denied literacy, who had no access to newspapers, no contact with federal officials, no way of moving beyond the property without permission, freedom wasn't automatic. It was something that had to reach you. And reaching you required that no one in your immediate world actively worked to prevent it. Cornelius Hartwell began that prevention immediately. He didn't, as far as any record shows, share his specific strategy with his wife or with Prentice. He worked quietly. He worked fast. And he worked with a patience that, in retrospect, makes the whole enterprise more disturbing, not less. In the second week of May 1865, about a week after the last significant Confederate surrender in the Deep South, Cornelius Hartwell gathered the plantation's workers at the edge of the main yard, the dusty, heat-soaked open area between the worker cabins and the barn complex. He'd done this before on various occasions, to announce planting schedules, to address disputes, to deliver warnings. This time, he arrived with a letter in his hand. The letter was real. It bore a genuine seal. But it wasn't what he claimed it was. He told them the war had entered a new phase, that Union forces had suffered a catastrophic defeat in Virginia. The details were vague, as designed. That President Lincoln, facing political collapse, had suspended the Emancipation Proclamation as a condition of a temporary armistice. He told them the status of enslaved people in Confederate states was legally and officially unchanged. He told them that anyone who left the property or attempted to contact federal authorities would be doing so in violation of existing law and would be returned by local sheriffs or Confederate Home Guard remnants still operating in the region to face punishment. He said all of this calmly, the letter in his hand, held up but not passed around. None of it was true, but for the men and women standing in that yard in the brutal Georgia May heat, there was no mechanism to verify it. No newspaper, no federal presence within easy reach. The nearest town of any size, Darien, was still functionally devastated. And every white authority figure in their immediate world, the county sheriff, the local magistrate, the plantation overseers from neighboring properties, was, in ways Hartwell had already begun arranging, prepared to confirm his version of events if asked. The workers dispersed back to their cabins in silence. The next morning, they returned to the fields. What happened in the days immediately after that gathering is reconstructed primarily from testimonies collected by Freedmen's Bureau agents in the fall of 1866. Testimonies that were themselves fragmentary, given by people who had been under sustained psychological pressure for over a year, and who, even in freedom, often struggled to reconstruct the exact sequence of what they'd been told and when. But across those testimonies, certain details repeat with enough consistency to suggest accuracy. One worker, a man in his late 30s named August Grover, the name he later chose for himself, taken from the month of his effective liberation, described the gathering in terms that remained consistent across two separate interviews months apart. He said Cornelius Hartwell had spoken quietly, almost gently, that there had been no shouting, no threats of physical violence, no visible weapons, that the performance of authority had been entirely procedural, a man with a document explaining a legal situation. He didn't look afraid of us, Grover told the bureau agent. That was the part that made me believe it. A man who's lying looks afraid of you finding out. He didn't look afraid at all. That composure, that total performative calm, was itself a form of evidence. It suggested Hartwell knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't improvising. He had thought this through. And over the following weeks, as summer deepened and the cotton grew tall in the Altamaha fields, he continued to refine and maintain the deception with a precision that bordered on the methodical. To understand how a deception of this scale could be maintained for nearly 2 years, it helps to understand the geography of isolation. Hartwell Plantation was not inaccessible. It wasn't hidden. There was a road that ran from the property into Darien. And Darien wasn't a ghost town, even burned and damaged. It had functioning commerce and a small white population. But the road was walked or traveled only with knowledge of what lay at either end. And for the workers on Hartwell's property, what lay in Darien was not freedom, but a white community that in 1865 coastal Georgia was overwhelmingly hostile to any black person arriving without explicit authorization from an employer. The social architecture of the Low Country was designed, even in peacetime, to make unauthorized movement dangerous. This didn't require active conspiracy from every white person in the county. It required only that the default behavior of white authority figures, sheriffs, merchants, local officials, was to be skeptical of and unhelpful to any black person whose presence couldn't be accounted for by an employer. Hartwell didn't need to coordinate an elaborate conspiracy across the county. He needed only to ensure that the people most likely to correct his workers, understanding of the law, weren't going to do so voluntarily. In the weeks following his gathering, Hartwell made several quiet visits to neighboring property owners and a few key figures in Darien. The details of those conversations aren't documented. They couldn't be, given their purpose. But the outcomes can be inferred from what followed, when, over the course of the summer and fall of 1865, several workers from Hartwell's property made cautious attempts to gather information, approaching a neighboring farm, speaking to a worker from a different property who sometimes passed on the road. They received confirmation of Hartwell's story, or at minimum, enough ambiguity to prevent them from acting on their doubts. This ambiguity wasn't accidental. In a region where the planter class had for generations controlled information as a tool of social management, the instinct to support a neighbor's version of events over a black laborer's confusion wasn't a moral decision so much as a reflexive one. The social system produced cooperation without requiring Hartwell to explicitly solicit it. There was also the matter of the Freedmen's Bureau. Established in March 1865, the Bureau was charged specifically with assisting formerly enslaved people in the transition to freedom. By the fall of 1865, it had agents operating in Georgia, but its reach in rural coastal counties was severely limited by understaffing, by the active hostility of local white officials who obstructed its work at every turn, and by the simple physical reality that agents covering enormous territories couldn't visit every property, follow up on every rumor, or verify every report of labor irregularities. Hartwell wasn't on anyone's immediate list of concerns. In the meantime, life on the plantation continued in its established grooves. The early morning bell. The rows of cotton stretching to the tree line. The evening return to the cabins. The meals prepared over the same fires. The children playing in the same dust. The rhythms of coercion had been so thoroughly built into the structure of daily life that they didn't require constant enforcement. The system ran on momentum, on the accumulated weight of routine, on the reasonable assumption that the world outside the property was more dangerous than the world within it. But something was happening inside the cabins at night that Cornelius Hartwell hadn't fully anticipated. People were talking. Specifically, an older woman named Delphine Cray, known simply as Delphine among the workers, somewhere in her late 50s, born on the property. Her mother, having died on it, had begun, quietly and carefully, to collect information. She couldn't read, but by multiple accounts gathered later, she was a person of exceptional memory and analytical intelligence. She had listened to Hartwell's announcement with a particular kind of attention. The kind developed over decades of being required to appear invisible while in the presence of white authority figures, and using that invisibility to hear things not intended for her ears. What she noticed in the weeks following the announcement was a specific quality of behavioral change among the white members of the household. Cecilia Hartwell, Cornelius's wife, had always been a woman of precise and rigid social habits. She received visitors on particular days. She corresponded with relatives in Savannah and Augusta through a regular mail arrangement. But in the weeks after the announcement, Cecilia Hartwell had stopped receiving visitors. Her correspondence, as far as Delphine could determine from the movement of mail through the house, having spent years working in the main house, had contracted sharply. The Hartwells weren't inviting people to the property. They weren't hosting. They were managing their social exposure. That, Delphine understood, was the behavior of people keeping a secret. She didn't yet know what the secret was. Not precisely. But she knew enough to begin a different kind of listening. In the early months of 1866, the balance of the deception began to strain under its own weight. The first significant crack came not from inside the plantation, but from outside it, and not from a federal agent or bureau official, but from a man named Henry Odom, one of the most unlikely sources imaginable, a poor white farmer from the northern edge of McIntosh County who had no particular sympathy for the formerly enslaved and no political stake in Reconstruction, but who had a deeply practical interest in free labor markets. Odom was attempting to establish a small farm operation of his own. In early 1866, he had been contracting with freed black workers from surrounding properties who had negotiated their own labor arrangements under emerging sharecropping and freedmen's contract systems. His property was barely 100 acres, but he was ambitious, competitive, and increasingly frustrated by what he perceived as Cornelius Hartwell's unfair advantage. Hartwell's plantation was producing cotton at a rate that made no economic sense to Odom given current labor costs. Odom wasn't a man of refined sensibilities, but he understood numbers, and the numbers coming off Hartwell's property suggested a labor cost that was effectively zero. In the spring of 1866, Odom made a complaint to the County Freedmen's Bureau agent, not out of moral concern, but out of competitive grievance. He wanted an investigation. He believed Hartwell was suppressing the free labor market through some arrangement that constituted, at minimum, fraud. The bureau agent, a 26-year-old from Ohio named James Pruitt, had been in the county less than 4 months and was managing an enormous caseload across 3 districts. He initially filed Odom's complaint at the bottom of a considerable stack of grievances. The sort of complaint he received regularly. White farmers accusing each other of irregularities, often with self-interested motives. It didn't immediately suggest anything more serious than a contract dispute. What moved it to the top of his attention about 3 weeks later was a second report. This one came from a woman who had worked on a neighboring property and had recently relocated to Darien following her own labor contract negotiations. She had, in the process, spoken with a man she knew from her previous property who had a relative on Hartwell's land. What she reported to Prewitt wasn't direct testimony. It was relayed partial, imprecise. But the core of it was this: the workers on Hartwell's plantation did not know the war was over. Prewitt sat with that sentence for a long time. Then, he wrote a letter to his supervisory agent in Savannah, Colonel Thomas Hatch, a former officer with a reputation for both procedural rigor and personal impatience, and described what he'd been told. He requested authorization to conduct a formal visit to the Hartwell property. Authorization was granted within a week, but what happened next introduced a delay of nearly 2 months. A delay that, in retrospect, looks less like bureaucratic inefficiency and more like the product of active interference. The day before Prewitt was scheduled to ride to Hartwell's property, he received a visit from McIntosh County Sheriff Larson Gale. Gale was polite, direct, and brought with him a document, a labor contract signed by what appeared to be 3 representatives of the Hartwell workers, acknowledging that they had been informed of their status as free persons and had agreed to continue working for Cornelius Hartwell under a wage arrangement. The signatures were marks, X's, beside printed names. They could have been made by anyone. Gale told Prewitt that an investigation of the Hartwell property was unnecessary and would disrupt a functioning legal labor arrangement. He suggested, not threatened, but suggested, that Prewitt's resources were better directed toward properties where genuine violations were occurring. Prewitt was young, new to the county, and unsure what he was looking at. But he wrote everything down. He wrote down Gale's visit. He wrote down the document. He wrote down the names on the contract. And he wrote down the date of the visit and the fact that it had come exactly 1 day before his scheduled inspection. That timing, he noted in his journal, was not a coincidence. Inside Hartwell Plantation, through the late winter and into the spring of 1866, Delphine Cray had been building something. It had no name. It wasn't organized in any way that would have been recognizable as an organization to an outside observer. It was, in its essence, a network of careful listeners. People who trusted her, people she had known for decades, people whose judgment she had assessed and found reliable. There were 9 of them, varying in age from a 22-year-old man named Solomon Price to an older man in his late 40s named Reuben Tanner, who had been a skilled carpenter before the war and had, over the years, developed relationships with white tradesmen in Darien that occasionally gave him reason to travel to and from the town. It was Tanner who, in March 1866, brought back a fragment of information that changed the character of what Delphine was doing. He had been sent to Darien by Hartwell to purchase hardware for a fence repair. A trip Hartwell had calculated was safe because Tanner's movements in town would be observed and because Tanner had shown, across many years, a reliable and compliant disposition. What Hartwell hadn't calculated was that Tanner, in his years of tradespeople contacts, had developed a specific relationship with a black freedman in Darien named Marcus Sewell, who operated a small repair shop on the edge of the burned district. Sewell, unlike the workers at Hartwell's plantation, was fully free since February 1865, registered with the Freedmen's Bureau, signed labor contracts under his own name, operating his business openly for over a year. When Tanner appeared in his doorway, looking, Sewell would later testify, like a man who had walked out of a time already gone. Sewell recognized immediately that something was wrong. The conversation between them was short. Sewell couldn't risk being seen in extended conversation with a man from a known plantation. The social observation networks of the county cut in every direction, and he had his own business to protect. But he was direct. He told Tanner that the war had been over for nearly a year, that Lincoln had been assassinated, that there was a Freedmen's Bureau office with an agent specifically supposed to help people in Tanner's situation, that the contracts Hartwell claimed were in effect were almost certainly fraudulent. Tanner bought his hardware. He walked back to the road, and then he returned to Hartwell's property and told no one what he had heard. Not for 4 days. Those 4 days are documented in his later testimony, and they are among the most psychologically precise passages in the Bureau's records from this period. Tanner described a process of internal argument, of testing what Sewell had told him against everything Hartwell had told them, against the visible reality of life on the property, against every small observation he had made over the past year. He described specific moments of doubt. The way Hartwell's wife had stopped hosting visitors, the absence, now that he examined it, of any Confederate soldiers in the area, the fact that a federal agent had appeared at a neighboring property several months earlier and hadn't been attacked or turned away by Confederate forces as Hartwell had claimed would happen to any Union presence. He also described something else, something harder to categorize clinically, but that comes through in his testimony with striking clarity. He described fear. Not fear of Hartwell, fear of hope. Fear that if he told the others what he'd heard and it turned out to be wrong, another lie, a test designed by Hartwell to identify the most restless among them, the consequences would be severe. The deception had done something to his ability to trust information. It had made hope itself feel dangerous. On the 5th day, he told Delphine. She listened to everything he said without interruption. Then she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, and this is preserved in her testimony nearly verbatim, because the Bureau agent who recorded it wrote it down, exactly as she spoke. I knew he was lying. I didn't know what the truth was. Now I do. Over the following 2 weeks, with a caution that Tanner found almost physically painful, Delphine and he determined what they were going to do. They weren't going to leave the property in a mass action. That was a scenario Delphine had thought through carefully, and it carried too much risk. Not from Hartwell directly, but from the county infrastructure of white authority that had supported his deception. If they moved as a group, they would be visible, likely intercepted, and they had no proof. Nothing that an outside authority would immediately recognize as evidence of what had been done to them. What they needed was a federal agent. Specifically, they needed the Freedmen's Bureau agent to come to the property, not in response to an outside complaint, but in response to something the agent himself had initiated. And they needed to be prepared when he arrived to speak clearly about what had happened, and to have enough corroborating voices that their testimony couldn't be dismissed. For that, they needed time, and they needed to continue visibly, and apparently willingly, the routines of the plantation, to continue appearing, to Hartwell's observation, exactly as they had always appeared. What Delphine and Tanner were doing in those weeks was the inverse of what Hartwell had done to them. They were managing his perception of their knowledge. They were performing a version of themselves that he expected to see, while underneath that performance, building something that would outlast it. The tension of that period, living inside the deception while dismantling it from within, is almost impossible to fully reconstruct from documentary evidence. But the testimonies from multiple workers describe a quality of those weeks that one bureau agent characterized in his report as an almost unbearable precision of self-control. They kept working the fields. They kept responding to the bell. They kept their faces in Hartwell's presence exactly as they had always been. And then, in late May 1866, two things happened almost simultaneously. James Pruitt finally arranged a second inspection visit to the Hartwell property. This time, without notifying the county sheriff in advance. And Cornelius Hartwell, who had maintained his composure for over a year, made his first mistake. The mistake was Prentice. In the 3 weeks before Pruitt's arrival, Prentice Hartwell had been drinking more than usual. He was 24. His hand would never fully function again. Whatever he had seen in battle had left deposits in him. He couldn't seem to clear through any available means. He had always, by accounts from neighbors and family correspondents, been the less stable of the two Hartwell sons. Impulsive where Edmund had been steady, prone to emotional weather where Edmund had been calm. His father had managed this by keeping him peripheral to the plantation's operations, giving him tasks meaningful enough to occupy him, but not consequential enough to endanger the more delicate aspects of the arrangement. In the first week of June 1866, Prentice got drunk in the evening and walked to the worker cabins. He didn't intend to reveal anything. He wasn't carrying a confession. He was carrying, instead, a grievance. The specific whiskey-fueled grievance of a young man who had given something enormous and received nothing useful in return. He wanted someone to acknowledge that the world had been destroyed and rebuilt wrong. He wanted someone to listen without the composed, measured responses his father required of all household interactions. What he said to the two workers he found still awake outside a cabin near the road wasn't a direct admission. It was fragmented, emotional, largely incoherent. But within it, repeated in different forms, was a phrase that both workers later testified to clearly. "You all don't even know what you are now. You don't even know." They did know, of course, by then. Delphine's network had spread the information carefully to every adult on the property over the preceding weeks. But they gave Prentice nothing. No reaction, no question, no indication his words had landed anywhere significant. They listened with the faces they had practiced. And when he finally wandered back toward the main house, they sat in silence for several minutes before one of them spoke. Solomon Price, the youngest member of Delphine's network, had witnessed the conversation from inside the cabin through a gap in the planking. He went to Delphine before dawn. The next morning, James Pruitt arrived at Hartwell Plantation with 2 accompanying officers and a mandate from the Savannah Bureau office that was, this time, not easily set aside. Cornelius Hartwell met them at the road. He was, as all accounts agree, entirely composed. He invited them onto the property, offered them water, presented the labor contracts, including the one with the X marks that Sheriff Gale had shown to Pruitt months earlier. He spoke about the challenges of the transition period, about the importance of maintaining agricultural productivity in a disrupted region, about his respect for the legal process and his full cooperation with Bureau oversight. Pruitt listened to all of it, and then he asked to speak with the workers directly, without Hartwell present. That was the moment. Hartwell had prepared for many contingencies, but he hadn't fully prepared for a federal officer who had done enough homework to know that any interview conducted in the employer's presence was, effectively, not an interview at all. The legal authority was clear. Pruitt had the right to conduct private interviews, and Hartwell, faced with 2 armed officers and a formal bureau mandate, had no legal mechanism to prevent it. He said calmly that he had no objection. He was lying again. But this time, he had no way to make the lie effective. Pruitt conducted interviews throughout the day. He began with workers selected at random from the fields. Within the first hour, the shape of what he was looking at became unmistakable. The workers he spoke with, even those who hadn't been part of Delphine's inner network, even those who had only recently been given the information through that quiet underground, gave him a consistent account. Not because they had coordinated their testimony, but because the truth, once confirmed, tends to organize itself clearly. By midday, Pruitt had spoken with 14 workers. He had documented in detailed notes the specific contents of Hartwell's original announcement in May 1865. The false claims about Lincoln, the armistice, the suspension of the proclamation. He had documented the information management that followed. He had documented the labor performed, the absence of wages, the social isolation of the property. In the afternoon, he asked specifically for Delphine. She had been waiting all day with a patience she had been practicing in various forms for the better part of a year. She sat across from Pruitt in the shade of a storage building and answered every question he asked in full, measured sentences, with a quality of recall that Pruitt described in his report as remarkable in its precision and consistency. She described the initial announcement. She described the behavioral changes in the Hartwell household that had first signaled to her that something was wrong. She described Tanner's trip to Darien and his conversation with Marcus Sewell. She described the network she had built, the decision-making process, the 4 weeks of continued labor under deliberate concealment of what they knew. Pruitt asked her why they hadn't simply left once they knew, why they had stayed another month. Delphine was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Pruitt included verbatim in his official report. "We needed a witness. Leaving just gets us back to where we were before. Moving through a county full of people who would rather not see us. Staying meant we could hand you the proof in one place. He built this very carefully. We needed to take it apart the same way." Pruitt sat with his notes that evening and wrote a 22-page preliminary report. He listed the names of every worker he had interviewed. He listed the specific false claims Hartwell had made. He cataloged the labor, cotton harvested, fields worked, man-hours estimated, and calculated a financial figure representing unpaid wages for approximately 63 workers over approximately 22 months. The number was substantial. He also listed the names of individuals he believed had knowingly supported the deception, including Sheriff Larson Gale, 2 neighboring property owners, and a magistrate whose role in confirming Hartwell's false legal claims had been described by multiple workers. Cornelius Hartwell was formally notified that evening that his labor arrangements were void, and that he was under investigation for fraud and violation of federal civil rights statutes. He stood in his doorway when Pruitt delivered this notification, and he was still composed. His face didn't change. He said he expected the matter would be resolved through proper legal channels. He was wrong about what the legal channels would deliver, though he didn't know that yet. The case against Cornelius Hartwell moved through the Bureau's legal system over the following 8 months, producing a documentary record that is both substantial and, in its ultimate outcome, characteristic of the period in ways that are not satisfying to anyone seeking a tidy conclusion. What the investigation confirmed in full was this: for approximately 22 months following the end of the Civil War, 63 men, women, and children had continued to labor on Hartwell Plantation under the sustained, deliberately maintained false belief that they were still legally enslaved. They had been held not by physical chains, but by the systematic management of information, by the deliberate withdrawal of news, by the construction of false legal documents, by the coordination of a social network of white authority figures who, by active participation or complicit silence, ensured the truth could not reach them. The financial calculation Pruitt included in his report, the back wages owed to those workers, was never paid. This wasn't a failure of the investigation. The investigation was, by Bureau standards, thorough. Pruitt's report was accepted, amplified by Colonel Hatch's office in Savannah, and forwarded to the military authority governing Georgia's Reconstruction District. The case was real. The evidence was real. The legal violations were clear. What wasn't clear in 1866 and 1867 was who had the authority to enforce remedies against a white Georgia landowner in a state whose political reconstruction was proceeding through layers of resistance, negotiation, and deliberate legal obstruction by state and local officials. The military courts that had jurisdiction were operating in a political environment already beginning to contract. The political will in Washington for aggressive Reconstruction enforcement was, even in 1866, beginning to erode under the pressure of President Johnson's active hostility toward the project and the resistance of Southern white political culture at every level. Cornelius Hartwell was not imprisoned. He was assessed a formal penalty, a fine, the amount of which was set at a level that represented a fraction of what the unpaid wages would have totaled, and which was itself subject to a lengthy appeals process that further reduced its practical effect. Sheriff Larson Gale was removed from his position by the military authority overseeing Reconstruction in the district, one of the more tangible outcomes of the investigation. But he was within 2 years restored to a similar position through the normal mechanisms of Georgia local politics. The neighboring property owners and the magistrate listed in Pruitt's report were investigated and found, in the Bureau's careful legal language, to have provided material support and resulted in formal letters servitude through deliberate misinformation. A finding that resulted in formal letters of censure filed a federal record that no one with it made decade, no one in Detroit County was actively maintaining. Then would not take cumulatively maintaining. Pruitt's full 22-page report was filed with the Bureau's Central Records Office in Washington in the fall of 1866, cataloged, stamped, and stored. In 1872, when the Freedmen's Bureau was formally dissolved by Congress, its mission declared, with considerable political dishonesty, to be essentially complete, its records were transferred to the War Department. They sat there, organized but largely unread, for decades. In 1949, a historian named Marion Calhoun Hess, researching Georgia Reconstruction labor practices for a book on the sharecropping system, found Pruitt's report in a box of transferred Bureau documents at the National Archives. She recognized immediately what she was reading. The book she published the following year included a chapter on Hartwell Plantation that remains, to this day, the most detailed secondary account of the case. Her work generated a brief period of scholarly attention and then receded, as academic work on specific Reconstruction-era cases tended to do, into the specialized bibliography of a field that the general reading public did not then, and has not since, fully engaged with. The workers themselves, the 63 people whose lives were suspended in that deliberate historical pause, dispersed after the investigation was concluded. Some went to Darien, some went to Savannah, some left Georgia entirely, joining the early streams of black migration to northern cities that would over the following decades become one of the defining demographic movements of American history. Delphine Cray went to Savannah. She settled in a neighborhood near the waterfront, in a boarding house run by a woman she had known slightly before the war. She lived for another 11 years. She never learned to read. but by multiple accounts from people who knew her in those final years. She was a woman of formidable presence, someone who listened with unusual attention, who asked questions that seemed simple and turned out not to be, and who had a specific, sometimes unsettling habit of identifying when the people around her were not telling the truth. Reuben Tanner settled in Darien, working again as a carpenter. He and Marcus Sewell, the freedman whose brief conversation with Tanner in the hardware shop had been the original crack in the deception, established a working relationship that lasted years. Whether they ever spoke specifically about what had happened, there is no record. Solomon Price, the youngest member of the network Delphine had built, made his way eventually to Philadelphia. He lived until 1921. He left no published memoir, but a granddaughter interviewed in the 1970s as part of a local oral history project described him as a man who had very strong feelings about who controls what you know. She said he had told her more than once that the most dangerous thing that could ever be done to a person was not to hurt them. It was to manage what they believed. If you can do that, she quoted him saying, you don't need anything else. Cornelius Hartwell died in 1879 of the lung condition he had always claimed to have, which turned out to be genuine after all. Prentice Hartwell sold the property in 1883. It passed through several owners over the following decades. Its history as a Reconstruction-era fraud case largely unknown to those who worked and lived on it afterward. The land is still there. The tidal fields along the Altamaha still flood in the same seasons. The pine-flecked low country still holds its heat until November. What happened on that property was not a mystery in the sense that most mysteries are mysteries. Something unknown. Something requiring supernatural explanation. Something beyond the reach of human comprehension. It was in every way entirely comprehensible. That is perhaps the most disturbing thing about it. A man looked at a community of people, assessed what they knew and what they didn't know, calculated what it would take to maintain a specific gap in their understanding, and then did it quietly, methodically, for nearly 2 years. And the machinery that made it possible, the social architecture of a post-war Southern county, the information isolation of an isolated rural community, the institutional indifference that filed a federal report and then lost it for 83 years. That machinery was not unique to Hartwell Plantation. It was the ordinary infrastructure of a particular American world at a particular American moment. Hartwell didn't build it. He just knew how to use it. This mystery shows us something that has no comfortable resolution. That the most efficient forms of control never require force. They require only the careful management of what people are allowed to know. The chains that held those 63 people in place from May 1865 to June 1866 were made of nothing but information withheld with precision. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or do you think there are layers of this that even the investigators never fully uncut below? Leave your comment below. There are stories like this one buried in every county of every southern state, and we want to find them. If this episode gave you chills, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who cares about the real history of this country. The parts that don't appear in the textbooks. See you in the next video.